Hey team, we're going to learn how we can listen for and trigger events based on a long press as opposed to a click in React. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. I'm coming at you from Brazil, so shout out to all my Brazilian friends out there. So in this tutorial, we're going to walk through how we can listen to these long presses inside of a React app. React comes out of the box with what are called synthetic events, which are basically normal browser events, but they're kind of normalized and they're made a little bit easier to work with React elements and components. And they support a large amount of different events, such as what you would probably typically see as onClick handlers, where when you click something, if you want to fire a function, you can pass that right in as a prop. But this becomes a little bit more tricky when you start to think about gestures that you might not normally expect for a browser to default handle. While we can listen for things like onTouchStart, onTouchMove, we don't have anything specifically that says on long press or on swipe, so those are the kind of things that we need to either use a library for or develop ourselves. Now, if you're not sure what I mean by a long press, when I come over to this React page and I click this button, I'm just going to simply push down very quickly and let go. Where with a long press, I'm going to keep my finger trigger or my mouse button down a little bit longer before I let go, which is where the terminology of a long press comes from. Now, while you probably don't see a lot of support for that kind of thing inside of a desktop website, you typically see things on mobile devices such as this iOS simulator that I have here, where if I click and actually long press, we can see that one of the iOS features is to open it up in a little preview window instead of going to the link itself. But just because we're browsing on a computer doesn't mean that we can't still support a long press inside of our application. So to solve this, we're going to use a few different synthetic events that React provides to us so that we can listen for and try to determine when somebody is long pressing as opposed to clicking. Now to get started, I created this Next.js demo starter that we can follow along with. Now you absolutely do not need to use Next.js for this. You can use Create React App. But what Next.js does is provide me a nice little starting point so that we have some UI to work with rather than just a simply blank project. Now if you want to follow along, you can find a link to the starter right inside the YouTube description. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and copy this yarn create next app command, and you can go ahead and use npx if you prefer. And then I'm going to paste that into my terminal. I'm also going to add another argument to this. I'm going to say my long press app, where that's just going to be the project name. So at this point, what's going to happen is I'm going to now, using this Next.js tool, cloning down my project into a local directory. It's going to install all the dependencies, and it's even going to reset Git history so we have a fresh start. But once it's done, we can now cd into that directory and we can run yarn dev, which is going to spin up our local development server. And we can see here, once it's available, we have localhost 3000, which we can open up inside of our browser. And we can see once it loads, we have our new Next.js React application. Now really this application doesn't give us a whole lot, but what it gives us is these buttons where all we're going to do is test how when we actually click one of these buttons, such as click me, it's going to change the state of the application so that we see that it actively triggered that click. Now what we want to listen for is a long press. So if I actually try to long press it, we're going to notice that it doesn't do anything because it still thinks it's simply a click. Now looking inside the code, if we navigate over to source, pages, index.js, we can start to see that this is all React code, and all we're doing so far is we're creating that state, which is where we store what kind of action was taken, and particularly we're currently only storing that click, as we can see here in this click handler. But if we actually scroll down, we can see our buttons. I'm going to get rid of this little box here, but we can see that we have our button, and anytime you click it with the handle on click, it's going to update that state. Now all this other button does for reset is set that action state to undefined, just so that we know what's going on and we can reset it and get back to a clear state. But if we scroll down a little further, what we're additionally doing is taking that action state and showing a different image or GIF based on what that is, just so that we have something a little bit visual to indicate what we're working with. Now the idea here is when we click something, it's happening pretty instantaneously. So if I click it, I really just push down and lift back up right away. But if I long press, I'm keeping my finger down, whether it's on my mouse or it's on my device, for a little bit of extra time before I release it. So we can take that time into account and use that in order to determine when this is actually happening. So if we head over to our button, I'm going to expand this a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read as we work through this. But I'm going to add a few new handlers onto this button, including onMouseDown, onMouseUp, and then I'm going to add onTouchStart and onTouchEnd, because what we're going to do is we're going to track the time that somebody is actually interacting with this by triggering the start of that time with onMouseDown and onTouchStart, and then we're going to figure out when it stops with the mouse up and TouchEnd. Now, while it's a little bit more complicated than this blanket statement, we can see that onMouseDown will typically refer to somebody that's using, well, a mouse or a touchpad where they're actually clicking on something, as opposed to TouchStart, which really typically refers to interacting with a mobile device where you're actually touching with a touchscreen. But ultimately, I want to have a new handler function for each and every one of these. So I'm going to go ahead and multi-select to get this started, where I'm going to just add an ASDF in there. And we're going to say, I want to handle onMouseDown. I want to handle onMouseUp, handle onTouchStart, and handle onTouchEnd. And I also want to make sure that I update the case for each and every one of those to a capital O to make sure they're uniform. But now I need to actually define each and every one of these functions. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this block up onto underneath my handle onClick function. I'm going to again multi-select all of these, where I can start to define a function for each and every one of those, where once I have that function, I'm going to actually grab the name of the function, and I'm going to say I want to console log out the name of that function, just so that we can see what's actually happening. And it looks like I also selected handle onClick, and we know we don't need to define that again. But now we can see we have onMouseDown, up, we have onTouchStart, and onTouchEnd. If we head to our browser to start to test this out, we can see that if I start to click this button, I get the handle onMouseDown and the handle onMouseUp. Now, as we mentioned, I'm actually clicking on this with my touchpad here, so it's going to interact kind of like I would with a mouse, where it's not going to use the touch start because I'm not using a mobile or touchscreen device. Now, if I was using a touchscreen device, or if I open up my Chrome device simulator and refresh here, we can see that if I now click that, it's going to actually trigger all of these. Now, it's interesting because it is also triggering the mouse down and mouse up, but what we ultimately want to do is a long press. And if we clear these out, and if I actually do long press this, we can see that, well, I get that context menu, we can see that it only triggered that onTouchStart, which is exactly what we want in that particular use case. So now that we have those defined, and we know that we want to listen for this long press based off of that initial event, as well as the time that somebody's holding that down, we can now start a timer anytime that first event happens. So right below all these functions, I'm going to create a new function, and let's call this start press timer, where inside I'm going to create a new setTimeout function where I'm going to ultimately fire some code, but I'm going to say that at the end of a particular time segment that I want to use for my long press, and I looked it up and I think 500 milliseconds or half a second is pretty common, so I'm going to set it at that, but we can then console log inside, and let's just console log out timeout so that we can see how that works. But now I want to start this press timer anytime we mouse down, so I'm going to add it there, or if we use touch start so that we're covering both our desktop and mobile devices. Now, if I head back into my browser and I refresh and I actually click on it, we can see that it eventually console logged that timeout, but we can see that it happened when I actually clicked. Now we'll get to that in a little bit, but what we want to ultimately do is we want to see that whenever this mouse up triggers, we want to see if that triggered before the timeout occurred. And in this instance, it did. So that would be a click, but if it triggered after, we would know that that would be a long press. Now with this timeout, instead of actually trying to time how long the person actually is holding it down for, we can just say if it happened within that 500 milliseconds, we can consider that a long press, because we don't really care if it's longer, we just need to make sure that it's at a minimum that 500 milliseconds. So what we're going to do is we want to be able to cancel this set timeout anytime it happens before that 500 milliseconds. Otherwise, if this set timeout occurs, we can say that we want to update this set action state to our long press so that it is indicating that it is indeed a long press. I'm going to get rid of this console log here. Now I'll review this again in a second, but what we're going to do is we're going to set this timeout to a reference using React refs so that we have access to it in order to cancel it after that period of time. So I'm going to head over to the top of this page and I'm going to import useRef from React. And then I'm going to create a new ref by adding constant timer ref is equal to useRef. So with my ref, if I go back to my set timeout, I'm going to say I want my timer ref.current to equal this set timeout. And when using refs, you want to set the current value, as that's the API that React provides us so that we can always grab the current value of that ref. So now that we can actually access this timer ref, we want to cancel it anytime somebody lifts up their finger or stops their touch interaction. And I'll explain it again in a second. But what we want to do is run clear timeout, where we're going to pass in that timer ref.current, and we're going to add that both to MouseUp and TouchEnd. So just to try to explain this again, whenever we start this start press timer function on onMouseDown or TouchStart, what we're doing is we're starting that set timeout. Now, if somebody lifts up their mouse before that 500 milliseconds, we want to cancel it because that means that it's not a long press. But if somebody leaves it after that long press, we know that our set action is going to fire, which means whatever they're doing, they're lifting up after that 500 seconds. So we can successfully set action because we know at that point that it is a long press. Now, if I head back to my browser and start to test this out by clicking the click me button, we can see that it is indeed working as a click. Now, if I reset this though, and I try to long press it, we can see that we are getting that long press capability. However, as soon as I release that, it goes back to the click. Now, the issue here is in the order of events that are occurring, our handle onClick that exists happens after all these other things, and it has no context of what we already set that action state. So I'm going to console log out this handle onClick here just so that we can see exactly what I'm talking about. So if I come back into my app and now I long press, we can see that it is going to the long press, and we see on the right that I only have that mouse down. But when I let go and I get that mouse up, we can see that that handle onClick happened after the mouse up. And again, it has no context of what we were doing outside of this. So it just thinks that it's normally working as expected and it's going to fire that and set that action to click. So what we want to happen is inside of this handle onClick, we want to let our application know that it is a long press so that when this onClick tries to fire at the very end of all the different events, it doesn't actually run. So I'm going to actually use another ref, and I'm going to create a constant called isLongPress. I'm going to set that equal to useRef. And inside of my set timeout, once we trigger that set action for long press, I'm going to say isLongPress.current is equal to true. So now that we know by default isLongPress is going to be undefined, or we can even define it as a default of false. But what's going to happen is what we want to do is we want to look for that value inside of handle onClick, and we want to say if it is a long press, we're just going to bail out of that function. So right under this console log, so that we can still see that it's firing, I'm going to say if isLongPress.current, which if it evaluates to true, it's going to go into this function. I'm going to return out, but let's also console log out and say it's a long press, and I'm going to escape this quote to make sure that it's actually going to run and add that quote back in. But back in our app, we can see that if I click, we still get that click, but now if I handle the on long press and let go, we see that it was able to detect that it's a long press and it still works. Now at this point, our first interaction is working, but we can see here that I left this original interaction here. So if I start to click it again, we can see that all those same events happen, and it's still telling me that it is a long press where I just clicked it. Anytime I click it, it's not actually working as I expect it to now. The issue here is I'm setting long press to true, but I'm never resetting it anytime those events start again. So what I can do is simply go back to my start press timer, and instead of setting it to true, I'm going to set it to false right before any of this happens, so that if it isn't a long press, we can still determine that it is not a long press and treat it as a click. But now in my app, I can click, we get our click, I'm going to long press, we get the long press, and if I try to click again, we still get that click, and we get our long press. Now at this point, we're able to successfully determine if it's a click or a long press. But what if we wanted to determine this on another button? The way that we currently have it, we would have to duplicate all of this logic in order to separately track it. Now instead, we can move all this into a custom hook where we would use multiple instances of that hook so that we can track different buttons separately. Now to do this, I like to create a new hooks directory. So inside of source, I'm going to create my hooks directory, and inside I'm going to create a new file called useLongPress.js. And inside we're going to ultimately export a new default function called useLongPress. And inside we're going to return a new object, which is eventually going to have our data. Now here's the fun part. We don't really need to rewrite all this stuff. All we need to do is head up to the top of this home function, and I'm going to copy, or rather cut, all of this code that we wrote, and I'm going to paste it all right inside of this custom hook exactly as it is. But we want to make all this information available for our elements that we're adding it to. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to return this action state. So at the bottom inside of my return statement, I'm going to include that, but we also need to include all of the handlers so that we can actually apply them to the button that we want to. So the way that I'm going to do that to make it a little easier, and you'll see in a second, is I'm going to create a new property called handlers. And inside of that is where I'm going to add all these functions. So I'm going to multi-select again where we have our handle onClick, our onMouseDown, up, start, end, and we don't need the start press timer because that's an internally maintained function, but I'm going to copy all those values and paste it inside of the handlers so that we'll be able to pass that down inside of the hook instance. Now, the way that we're actually going to use this handlers property is we're going to spread it out onto our buttons so that it's just a little easier rather than having to define every single one of those manually. So instead of passing these as is, I'm going to also trim off the handle for the actual property reference. So yet again, I'm going to multi-select here, but I'm going to say for each of these, I'm going to grab the actual base value, add the lowercase o there. So now we have onClick and all the other ones that we're going to pass in right into our component. But finally, we want to make sure that we have the commas at the very end of those so that we have proper syntax. Now, I moved a little bit quickly there, so let's recap what happened. I created this new hook, which is really just a default function that I'm exporting from this file. I took everything inside of pages.index.js, and I literally just cut and paste it into this file. The only thing that I'm doing differently now is I'm returning this action state, as well as this property handlers, which includes all of my event handlers that I'm going to be able to pass on right onto a button. But now we want to actually be able to use this thing. So I'm going to head over to my index.js file, and at the very top, I'm going to say I want to import my useLongPress hook from, and I'm going to use @hooks, which I'll talk about in a second. Then I'm going to reference the file useLongPress, where the reason we're able to use @hooks, if you're following along with me inside of the starter, is because if we head to this jsconfig.json file, I have all these modules mapped out so that we can easily reference them within our application no matter where we are, rather than having to do relative paths and making it complicated. So all that said and done, this is going to be @hooks that's going to be referencing this hooks folder where I can then reference that useLongPress file. But now in my actual code, I'm going to say constant, and I'm going to destructure these values of action and my handlers. I'm going to destructure them from my useLongPress hook instance, where we know that we already have UI that's going to react to this action, so we don't need to do anything with that here, but we can take this new handlers property or value, and I'm going to head down to my button, and I'm going to replace all of these props with this simple spread out of my handlers value. Now, if we open up the app, we see that I missed one last thing, and we need to make sure that we import our useState and useRef inside of the hook as well, so that we can actually use those inside of this hook file. But now back inside of our app, I can click and we can see that it updates. I can even long press and it works just as expected. Now, to test that we can use this on multiple buttons, let's just hook up this reset button to also listen for it. So back inside of my index.js file, I'm going to literally just duplicate this line and rename this to other action and my other handlers, where I'm just going to simply console log out this value so that we can see that it's working independently. And I'm going to take other handlers and use it just like I am with handlers, head down to that reset button. I'm going to replace this onClick, and of course reset won't work after this point, but just to prove that this works, we can see that by default it's undefined, but now if I click it, or if I long press, we can see that it's getting those actions. And that's happening independently to the original relationship association that I had with the original button. So I can click that and long press it, but I can also do it with the reset, and we can see I'm getting clicks, but it's not updating the original action. Now finally, if you're using these onClick or onLongPress handlers, you likely want to trigger custom functionality whenever this occurs. And right now, the way we have it set up, we can't really do that, because if we change one of these handlers, it's going to change for all of our different buttons. Now we have different ways of how we can solve this, but one way we can do this is inside of our useLongPress hook, we can treat this like a function where we can pass in arguments if we want to. Where here, I'm just going to set it default as an empty object so that we can make sure that it's not going to throw a type error if it's undefined, but I can define a new destructured argument of onClick. So what I can do with this is if I set this value when I use this hook, I can trigger this. So down inside of my handle onClick, I'm going to go ahead and after my set action, I'm going to say if type of onClick equals function, I'm going to go ahead and trigger that onClick function that's passed in as that argument. So the way that I'm going to use that is I'm going to head over here and I'm going to say function handle onClick, which I'm defining again. I'm just going to say console log, hey, I'm working here. And let's pass this in inside of our original action where I'm going to say I'm going to add my onClick and set that equal to handle onClick. So now if I go ahead and click that button, we can see in addition to using that state where it's able to determine that it was a click, we can see that my console log of, hey, I'm working here, was actually added into the console. And if I wanted to define a separate one, such as function handle other onClick, which I know I spelled that wrong, but it doesn't probably matter for this demo. I'm going to say, hey, I'm not working here. I'm going to take this function and I'm going to add it inside of my other long press as onClick. And we can see when I click that reset that it is working and it's not working there. And I can click them independently and they're going to both work just as expected and still allow me to trigger custom functionality. The cool thing is no matter if we're on a desktop or if we are on a mobile device, we can provide a similar experience to give people new ways to interact with our content. Just because you're on a desktop site doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to use long press, but luckily with all the tools that we have available, we can kind of simulate how we can determine if it is a long press and trigger custom functionality right along with it. What's your favorite use case of using long presses within an app? Is it just simply what you see on iOS or Android, or do you have something fun you like to do with it? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn how to work with custom browser APIs, such as triggering a function anytime somebody actually scrolls to an element, check out my video, Trigger a Function When Scrolling to an Element in React with the Intersection Observer. Or if you want to save your click state or long press state, or just save some kind of state for user interactions, check out my other video, How to Save State in Local Storage and Persist it on Refresh with React. If you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.